Hello and welcome to the Paradox Podcast, the podcast about the business of the video games industry with me, Daniel Goldberg, Chief Marketing Officer, and my dear friend Shams Georgiani, Chief Business Development Officer at Paradox.
Yes.
I can say this in my sleep now. I can just
Yes.
it just kind of rolls off the tongue.
It's a useless skill to have.
How are you, Shams?
I'm actually pretty damn good. We have so much shit going on at the company right now. It is nuts, but it is exciting.
Yeah. What have you? I mean, you messed everything up when I was on parental leave. I come back and there's like
fires everywhere.
There's fires everywhere.
But I thrive in fire. It's always easier to steer a ship when there's a monster chasing you rather than having open seas.
Should we?
That's the business wisdom of today. You're welcome.
Should we introduce our guest before we talk about what's been going on? I think we should.
Yeah.
So we have a special guest today, Rikard Åslund.
Hello.
Rikard Åslund.
Awesome.
I have a story about that actually.
Right?
What did you mean? Yeah.
Let me just explain who you are first, and then you can do the story. Rikard is studio manager at PDS.
Yep.
Heading up the teams working on Stellaris and. Stellaris and other stuff.
Yes.
And he's also a bit of a veteran with Paradox and PDS. How are you doing, Rikard?
I'm good. Like I also told you guys before we started recording, I'm a bit tired. Since my youngest one has been keeping me up during the night. But no, I'm really good.
So now you can tell your story. What was the story?
About my last name, yeah. So my last name is Åslund, but since Å doesn't exist in so the English language, it's just an A. And and I always receive sort of comments about that being a problem if I speak to non-Swedes and go abroad and stuff like that. When I
Rikard Åslund.
Exactly. And when I met my wife wanted us to go on holiday, and she had commented about my last name and sort of whether that would be a problem, and sort of made fun of it. I said it's never ever an issue. And then we went to London, and we walked into the hotel, and she looked and she goes like, "So Rikard Åslund?" I was like, "Oh damn it." And at that point I knew I would never hear the end of it, which I haven't. And she's my wife, but she doesn't have my last name, and neither does the kids.
And at that point you decided to pursue a career in video games.
Yeah, exactly.
This is when you tell us that your wife's name is Incontinentia, no? Okay, but screw that. Rikard, can you tell us a little bit about your origin story? Because it's a really, really inspiring origin story by great mentorship and true leaders and people who are great at seeing great potential even at an early stage. Can you tell us the story?
And especially early on, right? So I actually been here for quite a while now. So I started my thesis work back in January in 2011, I think it was. And my mentor was no other than Shams.
Wow.
I don't remember exactly what I did. It was something with MMORPG and network and something like that. I remember Shams always gathered all the interns. I think it was in the beginning of every week, and asked people to sort of talk about what they were working on. Whenever it was my turn, Shams always listen and then went, "It's so funny, Rikard. I always get what everyone else is talking about, but I don't understand a single word." What is it?
Yeah, it was network coding, and I think it was some Java there as well. So it's just my eyes glazed over, and everyone else was talking about game design, so that was better.
Yeah, I actually worked. That was sort of based on if you remember the game Salem that we did.
Yeah.
It was based on some of the stuff in that game. Interesting game.
But tell us what you've done over the years at Paradox. You've been here for a long time now.
Yeah, so after the thesis work, I got employed as a programmer on PDS. So first of all, I worked on Sengoku, which I think is a great game. Then after that, I moved Clausewitz over with Olof Björk over to OS6. So I worked on CK2, which was the first game that was on OS6 as well. That was imported. After that, I worked on EU4 from the start and up until Conquest of Paradise. and during that time I also helped out on some other projects as well. After Conquest of Paradise, I moved over to Stellaris as a senior programmer, and then after a while on Stellaris, back then we didn't have a producer or project lead we had game directors, but we usually just one lead on the project. But as we were growing, it was clear that sort of there was too much on Henrik Ferreira's plate, who was the game director on the project. So Thomas asked me whether or not I could take the project lead role, which is basically the producer role. And I told Thomas that, but I don't really like people.
Well, that's in line with every other manager, basically. So.
Yeah, but I said, like, sure, I can take Stellaris, through release, and then after that I want to, go back and work in the engine team as a programmer. However, it turned out that what I realized was things that are difficult and people are a lot more difficult than code is. So I worked on Stellaris up until Utopia, and then I sort of became manager of all the producers. I worked on CK3, Imperator, and a bunch of other projects also as a producer during that time. Then I moved into the PDS leadership, and then basically been in PDS leadership for, I don't know, the last 3 or 4 years maybe.
What's your favorite What's your favorite Paradox game?
Like, in all honesty, my favorite Paradox game is Stellaris. I'm not a typical sort of Paradox or PDS player. I play a lot of sort of racing games and sports games and those types of games. So when I came in here, I was really the odd one. The odd one who didn't play board games and the odd one who wasn't a history nerd. So Stellaris was a lot more closer to my home with the space and Forex and all of that. Over the time, however, I love EU4 and I love Stellaris. I especially love in Stellaris the early exploration. I'm actually more interested in the early exploration in Stellaris than I am in mid and late game.
I'm quite similar actually. I'm the same. I really like the first couple of hours a lot in Stellaris. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were gonna say what your job is now?
My job is that I work as a studio manager in PDS, and I focus right now mainly on Stellaris. Before that, I had the title VP of Development, which is a very fancy title, but what it more or less means is that I was sort of the second in command in PDS and ran the various projects.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Can I, while we have you, can I ask what do you feel is maybe the greatest differences between PDS today compared to those 10 years ago when you started and when you guys were like 15 in total?
Yeah, so when I was employee, I think I was employee number 27, but that was at Paradox, right?
Yeah.
So PDS was a lot smaller, and now we are, I don't know, but maybe 200 people at PDS. So we are way bigger. I mean, a lot of things are actually the same, but since we are bigger, it's one thing that I actually didn't like when we grew, and I sort of grew with the company, moved up in leadership, was that I felt that I got further and further away from the actual development. But we have done stuff now recently that sort of allows us to get a lot closer to the products again, and sort of ensuring that with that the products have a lot more autonomy and a lot more sort of ability to affect things themselves and make decisions themselves. So,
yeah. That's good. I mean, that's what we talk about on the podcast, at least on the basic philosophy that we want people who are solving the problems to be as close to the problems as possible. And as any growing organization, you have to, from time to time, rethink where people are in order for them to be able to solve the issues. So happy to hear that from a management perspective that the changes we've made actually have achieved that result, and not just good ideas on paper.
I was going to say we want the people to solve the problems to be the problems, which I realized didn't really wasn't really a fair summary of the point you were making there, Shams.
But I think it's a classic thing that the people who are closer to problem are in a better position to also understand what the actual problem is. It's very common that you have a problem and then someone from afar, sometimes it has been me, comes in with sort of this assumption of what he or she thinks is the issue, and then they are completely off. So.
Cool.
All right, so for the episode today, we're going to talk a bit more than we usually do about how we actually make games. In particular, we're going to talk a bit about how we work with player feedback, both before and post release. So both before we release something and when a game is live. We've touched on this a couple of times in the podcast before, but we thought it'd be interesting to revisit with someone from the studio side as a guest. So how do we? How does input from the people actually playing our games affect our games? That's really sort of the big topic for today. Shams and or Rikard, what would you say the topic means to you guys? What kind of conversation should we expect here?
I mean, for me, it is what PDS is, right? Incorporating the player feedback is part of PDS culture and PDS identity. We used to have this old saying that we make the games we want to play ourselves. What that is about is that we identify ourselves with our players and try to make sure that we always keep their perspective in mind or their experience in mind whenever we develop the games. So for me, it's a very important thing.
Yeah, I think to me it comes back to the making sure that the business philosophy that we're actually making stuff people want instead of creating stuff that we think will sell. I think those are sometimes two different things when done poorly. But on the other side of the coin, it's also the tricky part, and I'm not saying we're there, but what happens if we only play or want to play the type of games that nobody wants to buy?
Yeah, exactly. What happens when you're wrong, right? That's when it gets really interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. There's good reason why we don't make RTS games, right?
Yeah. All right, that's good. So let's move on and start talking a bit about this then. So Rikard, you touched on this already, but if you were to describe like the general philosophy at PDS in particular towards player feedback and just player testing in general, you talked about this is really what you guys are at the core. Can you maybe expand on this a little bit?
I mean, PDS has always been known for having a very close relationship between the devs and the actual players. So we always been very keen on the developers, which means a programmer, for example, talking to the players directly and gathering feedback. We have always worked heavily with betas and so on that are more or less almost seen as developers who help us sort of shape the game and provide some fresh perspective. It's always very easy when you develop that you sort of get, I don't know what the English expression is. Swedish hemmablind, home blind, is that?
It's a word, home blind. It's an old Shakespearean term.
What's the translation? What's the English?
Myopic.
Myopic. Yeah, thank you.
So it helps to get a fresh perspective.
Yeah. And how, I mean, for those who might not know, what's the how here? Like, how do you actually go about doing this in sort of broad strokes? In terms, how do you get this feedback from players? You mentioned betas, for example, there.
Yeah, we have betas, and when we develop new games, the betas are actually included. Many cases way before we even announce. But we have a much smaller group. And we work very closely with them, and they also often help us develop the games, help us out with historical research, especially for the historical games. We also these days, and this we didn't have when I started, but we have this entire department who deals with user research, who does focus groups and stuff like that. We did a lot of that for CK3. And then one of the actual key things that we do are the dev diaries. And the dev diaries, they are presented in a way where it's sort of we are talking about what we are adding to the game. It could be a new game or it could be a DLC. But in reality, what we actually are doing is that we are presenting our ideas, presenting what we're about to do, and then we are getting feedback. And usually on that feedback, we make some adjustments. So if you want to change affect how a feature is, I would highly recommend to comment in the dev diaries and stuff like that.
So the dev diary is just basically like it's a way to test ideas. That's like the real purpose of a dev diary isn't to get people excited. It's to see what the reaction is on something before it's implemented in the game.
To some degree, yes.
How often does it happen that you present an idea in a dev diary and then you completely just ignore it and never actually pursue it because it's tested poorly?
Not completely, but I would say it's quite common that we make adjustments. It's also in some usually when we present stuff in dev diaries, especially for the live games, the games we do DLCs with, we don't want to present stuff that isn't already implemented. So in many cases, what we are presenting in the dev diaries is already implemented in the game. Meaning it's not as easy to sort of just rip it out. So it's mostly that we do small adjustments. But we always gather the feedback, and it's quite common that we take that feedback and do adjustments either post-release or in future updates, as an example.
So let me ask you this then: do you have an example of where you wish that you would have listened more to the comments on a dev diary? Like, was there ever a dev diary on any of the projects that you've worked on that was not well received, and you wish that you guys would have taken that more to heart than you did?
It's difficult. I mean, there were some comments in relating to Imperator and the dev diaries there, where we felt, I mean, when we shipped Imperator, we felt that we had a really good GSE on our hands, and this was what the players wanted. But from the reception, it was very clear that we were off.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, you could definitely see that in some of the comments on the dev diaries and so on.
That's really interesting. Can I ask you just a follow up on Imperator? Actually, we spoke about Imperator. It was a while back, but we had you on as a guest quite soon after the release of that game. And I think, in general, I would say it's, as you're kind of saying, that I think that a lot of people were quite surprised at the reception of Imperator when it released, and we weren't, like, as you say, like the general perception was that we felt we had a really good game on our hands. Has there been any? Can you point to sort of any specific things that maybe was taken away as learnings or like changes in how things are done based on that?
I think one, now I sort of going on game director turf here, but
yeah.
One of the key things is that on E4 we introduced something that we call monarch points or mana.
Mana.
That was one of the sort of Johan's core design things that GSCs should have, and we utilized that heavily in Imperator. However, it was very clear, like I said, on the reception, that we were off when it came to that. And in my personal opinion, I think where we failed were that the overuse of mana in Imperator caused for the people to feel that they did something and then the game did nothing. The thing if you're playing Stellaris, for example, there's a lot of waiting, but during the waiting, you feel that the game is doing something.
Yeah.
Like there's a progress bar progressing, and there's you are researching something. In Imperator, we didn't really have that. You sort of waited for the points to accumulate, and then you just did something. And I know this was something we talked about a lot during CQ3 as well. And I can't point to any specifics, but I know that we did adjustments in CQ3 based on the reception in Imperator as well.
Yeah. Can I ask, is there a risk of, like, I don't necessarily fear that we've now empowered our fans to really be loud the next time you do a dev diary, so they can kind of steer the direction of the features based on their reaction. But is there not a risk that you end up with confirmation bias um, based on the kind of interaction there with the fans that does it ever happen that you end up implementing a feature or taking a game in a direction based on what the fans are asking for, but there's zero interest in the dev team's desire to make a feature? Would you still pursue it, or does the feedback then from the players end up just confirming the stuff that you're already considering?
I mean, the feedback from players, we never blindly follow the play feedback if we don't agree with it ourselves. So in the Imperator case is that the reason why we changed direction and done a lot of improvements in Imperator is because we agree with the play feedback.
Okay.
So we are not. There is this saying sort of whether or not you govern by the players or governed by the vocal minority, and that we definitely aren't. But at the same time, I always try to remind people about this, that players who have strong opinions and take the time to write on the forums, write the Steam review, they do it because they're passionate.
Yep.
They care about our product. So you should always listen to that and try to, maybe ignore some of the sort of things that are there because they're very emotional and very passionate, and sort of try to, what are they actually saying?
Yeah.
And try to encompass that in our work. Our work.
I mean, it's such a luxury to have, right? That's like the best place you can be in, I think, to have a fan base that actually cares enough to express whatever the opinion is to you. And then whether that opinion is good or bad, or it's what you want to hear or you don't want to hear, it's still a luxury to have that, because the alternative is obviously doing something where no one cares, and then you're not getting any feedback at all.
Yeah,
absolutely. But I'm not going to lie, right? Of course, when we have review bombing, for example, going on Steam, and it's by people who have 800 hours in the games and say it's complete crap. Of course,
that hurts.
I would say it annoys me a bit, but I try to force myself to remember what I just said. So that these are people that are very passionate about our product, but it will lie if I wouldn't admit that it annoys me a bit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I then ask, what about in the cases where something is very divisive? Because this is the trouble I have. Like, for some games, it works really great for some people. People said this with Cyberpunk. I think, remember it with Magica. Some people were on the forums just posting all the time about how broken and bad it wasn't working. And then we had actually numbers who confirmed that, hundreds of thousands were just in the game and not experiencing any problems. And it ended up just being the people who had specific issues who were the vocal minority. And how do you balance that out? Because happy players are generally in the game and not on the forums, right?
Exactly. And one thing we do quite heavily, and we also try to help the individual developers see that as well, because the individual developers are also on the forums and so on. So when we have these vocal minorities, of course, that can affect them in a negative way as well. So what we try to always do is that we look at MAU, we look at DAO, we look at sales numbers. We also have telemetry data on sort of how people play the games, how long the play sessions are, and then we try to sort of figure out what is true and what isn't.
Yeah. That's monthly active users and daily active users, for those of you who are not familiar with the KPI terms that we use. And KPI is key performance indicators.
Key performance indicator. That's right.
Well, you opened up that can of worms. Let's talk about like analytics and metrics and those things. Like, what are the key ones that are those the key ones you look at? MAU and DAO. Like, how do you incorporate that part of it?
Yes, but if we, to focus a bit on the business side, we also, whenever we do DLCs, we look on stuff on sort of attachment rate. We look at, of course, look at retention and churn and so on. We also consider stuff at sort of how the various DLCs perform compared to each other and so on.
How do you, and that's, can you give some examples of how this ties into what you mentioned before, like how you take action on these numbers? Like, let's say, God, it's hard to give a good example, but
super high retention
Yeah, super high retention. Like, let's say retention is really, really high in a game, which is actually quite true for most PDS releases. What kind of actions can that lead to within the studio, would you say?
I mean, it could lead to things like that we try to ensure that we ride that wave, so to speak,
Yeah.
where we ensure that we are engaged with our players. It could be through releases, it could be through marketing activities, and so on. A classic thing that we actually do is that we look at um, what sort of content people react positive towards and when, because time is of the essence here as well, and try to ensure that we plan releases and content according to that. One thing we also at PDS balance quite heavily is that we have usually when we release expansions, we have a free part and we have a paid part.
Yeah.
And we actively think about how we balance content between these two parts. And usually we put most of the stuff in the free update in order to bring up the value for the base game and bring people back, and then have some of them, of course, buy the DLC.
Yeah. Speaking of balancing, can I ask, when you listen to player feedback, do you tend to favor the feedback which is about removing the pain points for the players, or more about enhancing the fun? Do you tend to favor one over the other? What's most important when it comes to feedback, do you feel?
Well, that's tricky because it's not really that one is more important than the other. We always try to find a balance between quality of life fixes and new features. The thing is with quality of life features is that doesn't quality of life features doesn't necessarily bring a reason for people to come back. So we always try to also make sure that we rework systems that people might have issues with, or improve systems, add new systems that cater to a specific player fantasy, for example. I mean, one of the things that I'm really excited about for Stellaris Nemesis, as an example, is that we have reworked how we worked with first contact events within that game. So first contact is basically when you encounter a new empire, and that how those system has worked is basically more or less been the same since launch. But we never really been completely happy with them. And now in Nemesis we have reworked them, based heavily on similar to some of the system we have with archaeologically, I can't even say the word, stuff in the game.
I'd like to talk a little bit about like I guess like our choice of themes or settings or even like genres for new games, and also in some way I guess expansions to our live games, because this is I think really where we get into the territory of like what we like versus what players like, and I think that's a really interesting thing to talk a bit about a bit more. So on sort of on my end on the publishing side, we're investing quite a lot more money and time these days in trying to understand the markets that we're trying to serve and the various players that we think are in that market. Like who is the kind of person we want to play one of our games, and what would they be looking for in our next game, and maybe who are the players we have today and who are the players we want in the future. And this is done through sort of various research projects where you try to identify certain groups of players, and then you might group them into archetypes and all of that stuff. Just coming back to the stuff you mentioned in the beginning, Rikard, about like this general philosophy of doing the games that we, and I think for PDS in particular, like creating games that we would like ourselves. Do you see a conflict there, or do you see friction there in like the sense of like we're creating a product that we want versus we're creating a product for a market that is defined in this fancy PowerPoint from someone somewhere in the company? Is that a natural fit, or is that sometimes cause for, I don't know, friction or disagreement?
It definitely sometimes causes disagreement, right? The advantage PDS has always had is that marketing and so on can present these various user research material that's usually super valuable, but we never ever sort of marketing says this, so we have to do that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
always it's a data point,
Yeah.
more or less.
The merits of the idea and the rationale behind it rather than X says.
Exactly. So for PDS, Paradox or publishing has never ever sort of come and said, you should do this game or you should do this DLC or you should do this expansion. As basic, of course, we work close together so people come with suggestions, which is great, but um, it's never that we do something just based on the data that we have.
Understood. And how do you feel that this looking, you know, over the years we've discussed tremendous amount of like other business models and like free to play. And there's no big secret that it's not like PDS is tremendously interested in free to play game models or finding a way to do a free to play grand strategy game because it's so far away from the stuff that we do. But how do you guys currently approach other things that are in the works in the future that could potentially impact us? But no, we're all getting old. We have our set ways as gamers, and as game creators we also kind of have our preferences. But how do you keep yourselves keeping up with some of the trends and stuff we see now? For instance, subscription becoming a much bigger thing. How do you kind of guys talk about those things and incorporating, because it's a trifecta, like how you guys consume and play and build games, and not one what the players say and what the market is developing into. How can you kind of consolidate all of those considerations?
We always try to follow the various trends, and we try to, with subscription, for example, we run experiments where we try to gather learnings in regards to how it worked. We did that for CQ2, E4, sorry.
E4, yeah.
With some really good results, at least in that sort of with that test data. We also, of course, look at stuff as we had Game Pass, for example. We look at streaming, but it's also it needs to make sense for the game as well.
Yeah, understood.
But I had one of those experience during Christmas actually, where I bought Cyberpunk on Stadia. I don't know, shockingly, who plays on Stadia, but they had a very good deal.
Some people do, yeah. They had a very good deal, yeah.
And I actually had that sort of thought that it would be awesome to be able to play 1 hour games and just move as seamlessly between the various phone, TV, computer as I was able to do with Stadia.
Yeah. And so looking at kind of in the future, do you see, on the topic of player feedback, and I know you specifically have had a sweet spot in your heart for having games run like more about not as a live service per se, but having a much tighter release cadence. You have an ill-fated project you were running for a while, laid on, and we might resurrect it one day. But the question is, do you see which one of these future trends do you see coming closer to what you're working on now? Like, is it streaming? Do you think that closer with player feedback? Do you see them designing small features, more UGC in the games that you incorporate? City Skylines has a lot of content creator packs. What's the interaction there with the fans and future looking for the business?
I think in the current environment, I think that the key thing is to try to work as close with the players as possible. I think the time for sort of doing these super big ambitious games and then taking all of that risk and then hope that it pays off a couple of years down the line, I think is a risky business model. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, but do you think that we'll see more player feedback incorporated in the future or less? considering the trends?
I think we're going to see more, but the tricky thing as we get bigger and we get more players, it's more difficult to sort of filter all of that feedback.
Understood. Taking this down a notch, like, do you guys read everything about the game?
I think you can sort of assume that at least one dev has read everything, or not one that read everything, but at least always someone on the development team that has read what is written. I browse the forums every single day. I look at Reddit. I check Twitter. The difference these days is that we might not interact in the discussions, especially on other medias other than our forums as we used to. But that's just because it's so much bigger than it used to be.
Yeah. And what is in concrete terms? What's the best way if somebody wants to kind of like, I really want better features relating to the borders in the Balkans in EU4? What's the best way of getting that feedback across to you?
I think, writing on our forums, writing the dev diaries, but also starting discussions on Reddit, I think are very good ways to do it. The social media presence is different in the various games. So I would argue, for example, Solaris has a high degree of presence, both on Reddit but also on Discord.
We've been running some.
Sorry.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to, and also engaging in the various discussions. So of course, there's a high chance of developers noticing if it's a big discussion. So when there is an ongoing discussion, engage in it.
We've been running some really good things over Discord on CK3 in particular, sort of smaller group sessions with players and devs where we demo stuff or have sort of smaller group feedback sessions, and those have been quite popular and quite appreciated. And we've seen that doing those things in a smaller and kind of more, I guess, more intimate group in a way, because Discord kind of lends itself very well to that, has been really positive. So I think that's something we're going to want to do more of in the future as well.
Yeah. And what about the other side of the coin? What's the worst way? Like, if you worst way, what guarantee that the developers will absolutely not listen to you? Providing
Steam review bombs. Go on, post a negative Steam review.
Review bombs, of course. Sending threats in DMs on Twitter. In general, I would argue that we actually, engaging in very sort of toxic behavior is a good way to get developers to stop listening. It's actually a bit problematic because when we have, let's say for example, the Reddit gets very toxic. Sadly, the effect of that is that our developers don't feel that they want to go there. The Steam forums is a classic example of that. Super toxic. I think it's a bit better now than it used to be, but it's still very toxic. So a lot of developers don't want to go there because it makes them feel a lot worse.
Yeah. Okay.
A very good thing, however, that we have these days is that we have community ambassadors and other community people that sort of are on all these various places and gather all the feedback in a very structured way that's then being sent to all the developers as well. So we're not, when we gather feedback, we're not dependent on individual devs taking the time to look through the various threads that are going.
Yeah, gotcha.
All right, we're gonna wrap this up with like your phone number and your home address, and just encourage everyone to.
We're just gonna post it right in there in the info below.
Yeah, but I think that's a good. I think maybe that's a good place to wrap up.
I think so.
So thank you, Rikard, for coming on the podcast and sharing your wisdoms. There's kind of fewer dad jokes than I was hoping for.
Do you want to round off with a couple of really good dad jokes? If for those that are not familiar with Rikard, this is I won't say why we've kept him on for all of these years, but a big part of why he stayed with the company for this years is that we tolerate his dad jokes, and he's pretty good at them. So, do you want to kind of?
Yeah, sure. I heard about a new restaurant called Karma.
Yeah.
They apparently lack a menu, but you get what you deserve.
God.
So bad.
We'll do a special episode, like maybe to round off the year, where it's like just you.
We should
can
have
solo.
a PDX-Con panel
Yeah.
with just dad jokes, like the worst dad jokes. So it would be great.
I told this one. I'm sorry, Daniel, but
Go
I
on,
need to
one
go.
more.
I told
Yeah,
this
yeah,
one
go
to
for
my
it.
wife, and she hates my jokes. But she
course she
liked
does.
this one. Yeah. And I said, I'm not sure how to interpret this, but when I told my wife that we should all learn to embrace our mistakes, she gave me a big hug.
It's like physically painful.
The last
It
one.
hurts.
I recently read a book about falling downstairs. It was a step-by-step guide.
Alright.
This is.
And I wish you listeners could see this, because like for the first, we can see each other on like video whilst we're recording this, and like for the first time for the entire recording, Richard is like leaning forwards and looking like engaged.
And everyone else is face palming, literally.
All right.
Well-
Look, Rikard, thank you so much for coming, and thanks everyone who listened. We will, as always, be back in a couple of weeks. If you have player feedback, listener feedback for us, leave a comment, ping us on Twitter with your questions, smash that subscribe and smash that like button, and tell us more about what you would like us to talk about next time. Take care and see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.